Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the auditor's responsibility with the deficiencies in the system of internal control discovered during the FS audit. Okay, so in PSA 2556, so this is entitled Communicating Deficiencies in the Internal Control to Those Charged with Governance and Management. So this standard deals with the auditor's responsibility in communicating appropriately to those charged with governance as well as in the management any deficiencies in the internal control that he has identified in an audit of the FS. So here the auditor is required to obtain the understanding of the internal control. So we've discussed this before in identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. Okay, so this is one of the requirement in the auditor in the preliminary assessment of the risks of misstatements. So in making those risk assessment, the auditor here will consider the internal control. So if you can still consider the table that we presented in our previous video lecture where the auditor has assessed the level of control risk. Okay, so this is, or the purpose of this is to design the audit procedures that is appropriate, okay, for such control, level of control risk and detection risk that he will accept. Okay, but this assessment or risk assessment is not for the purpose of expressing an opinion of the internal control's effectiveness. So please take note that the auditor will test the operating effectiveness of the internal control, but his purpose is for the risk assessment and for the design of the appropriate audit procedures and not to express the opinion on the internal control's effectiveness. Okay, so the auditor here will just determine if the internal control is strong or weak, okay, but he is not required to express any opinion for such effectiveness. So the auditor here may identify control deficiencies in the internal control, not only during the risk assessment, but also in any other stage of the audit, because especially if, for example, the auditor assessed or determined that the internal control is strong, so he will rely on the internal control. He will from time to time test the controls. So during those period, he might discover any deficiencies that exist in the internal control. Okay, so when deficiencies in the internal control are identified during the audit of the FS, so the auditor here, as required in the standard, he should communicate it, okay, to whomever it is appropriate, okay, for responding for those deficiencies. So either to those charged with governance or the management or both. So if in the auditor's professional judgment, such deficiencies are of sufficient importance to their attentions. Okay, but of course, if there is any deficiency, it is basically a must that this top management will be informed of so that they can respond, okay, and correct any deficiencies that exist. But in the first place, it should be the management's responsibility and not of the auditors. So a deficiency in internal control exists when first, a control is designed, implemented, or operated in such a way that it is unable to prevent, detect, and correct any misstatement. So meaning the internal control is not effective. Okay. Another is a control necessary to prevent, detect, and correct any misstatements in the FS uh, on a timely basis. Okay, this is just the same as having a weak internal control as well. Okay, this is a control is necessary, meaning there is no internal control probably that exists, or there is internal control, but it does not cover everything. Okay, that needs to be uh, controlled or prevented, detected, or corrected uh, any errors or fraud, okay, especially in the preparation of the financial statements. Okay, a significant deficiency in internal control. This means a deficiency or a combination of deficiencies that the auditor's professional judgment it is sufficient, important to merit the attention of those charged with governance. So here, the auditor will apply his professional judgment if he thinks or considers that deficiency as significant. These are the following indicators of significant deficiencies in the internal control. First is there is evidence of ineffective aspects of the control environment, such as indications that significant transactions in which management is financially interested. Okay, so this will create um, personal interest or advantage on the part of the management. So they might override the control so that this interest will be satisfied. Okay, so it will lead into fraud and as well as misstatement in the FS. Okay, and these transactions are not being appropriately scrutinized by those charged with governance. So, meaning there is indeed a lack of control that is being applied, or their internal control is weak when it comes to to the personal interest of those management. Another is uh, identification of management fraud that was not prevented by the internal control, because again in this case the management has over or they override the controls so that these fraudulent actions will be taken uh, and will take place, I mean, and um, the transactions related to that will be completed. Okay. Another is management's failure to implement appropriate remedial action on the significant deficiency that was previously communicated. So meaning even before there is already significant deficiencies that was reported by the predecessor auditor, but these deficiencies were not acted upon. So this will lead to the uh, commitment of the management on correcting such deficiency, since in this case they did not. So meaning there is something wrong, or there might be some uh, fraudulent actions that might be related to that inaction or response. Okay, another indication is or indicator is the absence of a risk assessment process within the entity. Okay, where such a process would ordinarily be expected to have been established. So basically, aside from the internal controls, the entity or the management should also establish risk assessment process. Okay, so we've mentioned this before, because this might include business risk, which will have a great impact on the entity's business operations as well as their financial statements. Since in this case, there is no risk assessment process. So, meaning that is considered to be a deficiency in their internal control because they did not establish establish such process. Okay, another indicator is evidence of an ineffective entity risk assessment process. In letter B, there is no risk assessment process. Here in letter C, there is risk assessment process, but it is ineffective. Okay, such as management's failure to identify a risk of material misstatement. Okay, where they are expected to detect such. Okay, so again, this is an indicator that of significant deficiency in the internal control. Another is evidence of ineffective response to identified risks, uh, or there is no controls over such risk. Okay, so we've mentioned this also earlier. Ineffective response, meaning there is uh, an action, but it is insufficient. So it is still considered to be significant deficiency because this response or action will not identify the risk. Okay. Another is misstatement detected by the auditor's procedures that were not detected, or corrected by the entity's internal control. So again, this is or there in this case the internal control is weak. So again, this is a significant deficiency. Another is restatement of the previously issued FS to reflect the correction of a material misstatement due to fraud or error. So meaning in the previous audit, it has been identified that there exists misstatement due to fraud and error. So meaning their internal control is not strong enough to detect such, and the auditor um, is the one who detected such misstatement. So again, this is considered to be a significant deficiency as well. Another is evidence of management inability to oversee the preparation of FS. So meaning there is loose internal control, especially in the preparation this time of the FS. So here, those who are responsible for preparing such will have the chance, okay, to commit error or even fraud. Okay, so significant deficiencies should be communicated on a timely basis, and it should be in writing to those charged with governance and to an appropriate level of management, unless this is inappropriate to communicate directly to the management under the circumstances. So again, it should be communicated on a timely basis in writing and to the appropriate level of management. So the auditor should communicate to management at the appropriate level of responsibility on a timely basis other deficiencies in the internal control that he identified during the audit that have not been communicated to the management by other parties. Meaning, there might be other parties, or for example, the internal auditors who have not communicated such deficiency. So this will include in the communication of the external auditor to the management. Okay, so in that, the auditor's professional judgment are of sufficient importance to merit the management's attention, meaning it is indeed significant deficiency. So such communication need not to be in writing, and it can be made orally. Okay, so the appropriate level of management is the one who are responsible and has the authority to evaluate agencies' certain types of deficiency in the internal control and to take the necessary remedial action, meaning they are the ones who are directly supervising or have the oversight of the internal control system in the entity. So So this should be the party that the external auditor should report or communicate those deficiencies in their internal control. So in some jurisdictions, law or regulation may require the auditor to communicate to the regulatory agencies this or certain types of deficiency in the internal control that the auditor has identified um, during the audit. So meaning in this case, aside from communicating it with the management within the entity, uh, there might be some law or regulations that will require the auditor to communicate these deficiencies to outside parties such as the regulatory agencies concerned for that deficiency. Okay, so although written reports of significant deficiencies are ordinarily the best communicated by the audit report release date, but it could also be communicated but not later than 60 days following the report release date. Okay, so meaning it should be within a short period of time so that attention will be called upon those who are responsible for acting such for the deficiency or the agency, okay, who are concerned so that it can be acted upon immediately. Okay, an auditor's written communication of these significant deficiencies is traditionally referred to as management letter, or it could be a report in reportable conditions. So they can also attach this in their auditor's report. Okay, but the communication here, if for example these deficiencies were assessed or determined before the end of the audit, so they can also have such communication with the management. So it is considered as a secondary product of the audit because again, the primary purpose of audit is to express an opinion on the fairness of the FS. So in the written communication of these significant deficiencies in the internal control, the auditor should include or must include the following. So the description of the deficiencies and the explanation of any potential effects in the management, in the entity, or especially in the preparation of the FS. A statement that the purpose of the audit was for the expression of opinion on the FS and not on the effectiveness or operating effectiveness of the internal control. This is just to clear out the purpose of the audit. So, another is a statement that the audit included consideration of the internal control relevant to the preparation of FS in order to design the audit procedures that are appropriate, but not for the purpose again of expressing any opinion on the operating effectiveness of the internal control. Another is a statement that the matters being reported are limited only to those deficiencies that the auditor has identified during his conduct of the audit. And based on his professional judgment, he concluded that these are sufficient importance to merit the attention of those charged with governance or the management. So, in this case, the auditor may also indicate in the written communication that if he has performed more extensive procedures on internal control, so the auditor might have identified more deficiencies to be reported or concluded that some of the reported deficiencies need not have been reported. Okay, so depending again on his professional judgment if that is appropriate. Furthermore, this written communication may indicate that this communication has been provided for the purpose of those charged with governance and that it may not be suitable for other purposes. Okay, for informing them of those deficiencies so that they will act upon it. And the purpose of this is to detect, correct, and prevent misstatements, especially in the preparation of FS. So if a previous communicated significant deficiency still remains uncorrected during the current audit. So the current year's communication, it can be repeated in the description, okay, from the previous communication, or they can simply refer to the previous communication, meaning they are calling again the attention of those charged with governance or the management about the significant deficiencies that were not acted upon. The auditor may ask the management, or if appropriate, those charged with governance, the reasons why these deficiencies has not yet been corrected. Okay, so what are the reasons? Is this acceptable or not? If the auditor has communicated deficiencies in the internal control other than significant deficiencies to management in prior periods, and the management has chosen not to remedy them for cost. So this is their reason for not correcting such deficiency because of cost or other reasons. Then in this case, the auditor need not repeat the communication in the current period because um, the the cost and benefit um, will also be considered. And in fact, benefit here is greater than cost. However, if the management is not able or they cannot afford to do so, then the auditor cannot force them. Okay. However, when the auditor may the auditor may decide to recommunicate these deficiencies if there has been a change in management, okay, or if the new information has come to the auditor's attention that alters the prior understanding of the auditor in the management regarding the deficiencies. Meaning, in this case, the auditor may decide to recommunicate this if there are new management team members have come in, because in the previous audit, they were not present, so they have no any idea about it. So they should also be, or their attention should also be called if for such deficiencies in the current period, or if there are any misunderstanding in the prior period, so the auditor may re-communicate these deficiencies. Okay, so those are for the auditor's responsibility with the deficiencies in the system of internal control discovered during the FS audit.